My son sat in the corner of the law office with that familiar smirk, the kind that says he's already counted the money, already assumed I'd walk away with nothing. After all, I was the forgotten ex-husband, the man who'd been quietly erased from the legacy his mother built. But then the lawyer read a single sentence from the will, and everything shifted. His smile vanished. His voice rose. And within moments the room trembled with the force of his outrage. You could hear a pin drop right before the shouting started. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful stories like this one, tales of loss, redemption, and the quiet twists of fate that change lives forever. What happened next is almost impossible to believe, but every word is true. Let me take you back to where it all began. The morning Elaine died, I was on my knees wiping up cold coffee from a cracked kitchen tile. The old mister. Coffee had sputtered again, and in my half-awake clumsiness, I'd knocked the mug clean off the counter, across the wall. Mrs. Gladys Jenkins was already yelling through the thin plaster, something about my porch light buzzing like a UFO and scaring her cats. I muttered an apology she couldn't hear. Not that it would have mattered. Gladys was committed to disliking me, rain or shine. At 68, my joints cracked more than my radio, and my mornings were a quiet loop of small annoyances and routine regrets. The phone rang. I let it go to voicemail at first, but it kept ringing, persistent, insistent. On the fifth call, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up. David Martin speaking. A voice, crisp, measured, answered. Mr. Martin, this is Richard Hale from Hale, Grant, and Emerson here in Casper. I'm calling about Elaine Wynne. My breath caught, but I kept my voice even. Yes? The pause that followed told me everything I didn't want to know. I'm very sorry to inform you that Miss Wynne passed away on Tuesday evening. The service will be held Friday at Laurel Chapel. You've been named in her final arrangements, and your attendance is requested for the reading of her will. For a moment, all I could hear was the whir of the refrigerator behind me, and Mrs. Jenkins' radio playing Sinatra too loud through the wall. Elaine. Gone. Just like that. I sat down hard in the kitchen chair, its wooden frame groaning under me like it had something to say. Elaine. My Elaine. The woman I'd loved, lost, and never quite stopped carrying around in the spaces between my thoughts. Mr. Martin? The voice nudged again. Yes. I'll be there, I murmured, the words tasting strange in my mouth. After we hung up, I stayed seated for a long time, staring at nothing, the damp towel still clutched in my hand. I should have cried, maybe, or raged, but the emotion came slower than it used to. It had to travel through years of silence, of stubborn distance, of memories I'd folded up and buried like old sweaters. I stood eventually and looked around my apartment, the chipped cabinets, the dented fridge, the faded curtains. This wasn't where we were supposed to end up. 17 years ago, when we signed those divorce papers, I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way back someday. But days became decades, and second chances faded into static. I spent the next 2 days cleaning an apartment that hadn't been truly tidy since Thanksgiving. I shaved twice, pressed my only suit, and replayed every moment I'd ever shared with Elaine like a film strip looped in my head, her laugh sharp and sudden, her hands always moving, always building something. And Tyler, our son, the last time we'd spoken, he told me I was holding him back, that I clung to a world that didn't exist anymore. You're a relic, Dad, he said, and I can't afford nostalgia. He left that afternoon and never came back. Now he was probably running her company, shaking hands in boardrooms, and telling himself he was exactly what she'd wanted. Friday morning came cloaked in gray skies and bitter Wyoming wind. I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the man looking back. Silver hair, tired eyes, a face that sagged under the weight of missed chances. On the drive to Laurel Chapel, I passed the houses we once dreamed of owning, the diners we used to visit when money was tight and happiness was cheap. As I pulled up to the chapel, gleaming stone, polished glass, valet parking, I parked my rusted Toyota between 2 Teslas and felt like a time traveler at someone else's funeral. Inside, the room was already buzzing with muted conversation and perfume. At least 200 people, maybe more suits, pearls, silk scarves. And there, at the front, standing like he owned the moment, was Tyler. My son. Elaine's living legacy. He saw me the second I stepped in and froze. Then his jaw tightened. I felt every eye turn. I was the ex-husband, the ghost of simpler times, the man whose presence was a stain on her polished legacy. But I came anyway, because I needed to say goodbye, and because something deep in my bones told me our story wasn't finished yet. I took a seat in the back pew, hoping the dark wood and shadows might shield me from the glares and whispers already beginning to circle like vultures overhead. But shame has a way of traveling louder than footsteps. I caught snippets. Is that him? After all these years? Elaine would never have wanted this. I didn't flinch. Not this time. I'd spent nearly 2 decades building up the callus that let me walk through a world that had rewritten my chapter as the villain in Elaine's story. Let them talk. They hadn't been there in 1986, when a 29-year-old woman in a red wool coat stormed out of Harrington's diner, furious about a hiring sign that read, "Men only for night shifts." I had been halfway through a dry ham sandwich when I heard her voice slicing through the late afternoon silence like a tuning fork. "You're saying women can't work nights because we're not reliable?" She barked at the manager, a thick-necked guy who blinked like he was hoping she might just vanish if he stared hard enough. She didn't vanish. She stood taller. I remember everything about that moment, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, the way her heels clicked against the tile floor, the business card she left behind like a challenge. Elaine Nguyen, organizational consultant. Efficiency is power. When she swept out into the snow and drove off in a beat-up Civic with a cracked windshield, I knew 3 things instantly. She was brilliant, she was terrifying, and I was completely, hopelessly hooked. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call her. I rehearsed the line 100 times, and when she finally answered with her clipped, efficient, Elaine Nguyen speaking, I nearly forgot how to breathe. "Hi, this is David Martin. We haven't met, but I saw you at Harrington's diner a few days ago." Silence. Then, "You're the guy with the mustard stain and the bad sandwich." I laughed, because it was true. "Guilty," I said. "I also left my number on the napkin your card was sitting on, just in case you didn't throw it away." Another pause. Then a soft chuckle. "Well, David Martin, did you call for business consultation or something else?" "Dinner," I said. "Something better than a ham sandwich, if you'll allow it." That Saturday night, she met me at Romano's. She wore the same red coat, but beneath it was a black dress that stopped my breath mid-word. We talked for hours about everything but work. She told me about growing up with 3 siblings in Sacramento, how she learned to read at 3, how she'd dismantled her father's VCR just to figure out how it worked. I told her about my job at the local power plant, my obsession with classic westerns, and how I made the world's worst lasagna. She laughed like she hadn't laughed in years, like the sound had been waiting just beneath her skin and finally found its way out. 6 months later, I proposed to her in that same diner, on that same cracked tile floor. No grand gestures, no hidden ring inside a dessert. Just her, me, and a simple, shaky promise. "Grow old with me, Elaine. Let's build something real." She said yes without blinking. We married in September beneath a sky so blue it felt like a blessing. She wore her mother's gown, refitted to her frame, and carried wildflowers we picked together that morning. My hands trembled as I slid the ring onto her finger, and when she whispered, "Forever," I believed her. For a while, forever felt possible. When Tyler was born 2 years later, red-faced and screaming like he had something urgent to say, we were still in sync. I remember watching Elaine cradle him in the hospital room, one hand supporting his head, the other flipping through a business journal. Even then, she was both. The mother who rocked him to sleep and the woman who mapped company hierarchies in her head. But looking back, I see the cracks forming, the late nights, the missed dinners, the whispers of just one more call. When Tyler turned 7, she bought him a Mac computer. Not a kid's toy. A real machine that cost more than my monthly wage. "He needs to learn the future," she said, eyes sparkling. "Kids who think digitally will own the world." I suggested teaching him how to fish instead. She laughed, but not kindly. That's when we moved to Laurel Ridge Drive. Big house, granite counters, a refrigerator with more buttons than my truck, a dining table that could seat 12, but somehow never had room for just the 3 of us anymore. Elaine's company, Nguyen Strategic Ventures, took off. Contracts, partnerships, media appearances. And suddenly, our home stopped being a home. It became a showroom, a staging ground. Somewhere in the polished surface of our new life, I lost sight of the woman in the red coat, and I think she lost sight of me too. But I never stopped loving her. Not once. Not even after everything. And that's why I was here now, sitting alone in the back of the chapel, while our son glared daggers at me across the aisle. Because I needed to say goodbye, not just to Elaine, but to the parts of myself I left behind, chasing a love I was never quite ready to let go of. Tyler's eyes hadn't left me since I walked through the door. I could feel his gaze like a spotlight, burning a hole straight through my pressed jacket and ironed shirt as if he was daring me to vanish again, like I had all those years ago. But I didn't flinch. I didn't shrink. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, my tie slightly too tight, my shoes too stiff. It had been 17 years since Elaine and I ended things, and almost that long since Tyler had looked at me like I was anything more than an embarrassment. And yet here we were, in the same room, wearing our grief like mismatched suits. The chapel itself was everything Elaine would have wanted. High ceilings, arched windows that poured in just enough filtered light to give the illusion of reverence. Mahogany pews polished to a mirror shine. Even the flowers, lilies, and white orchids looked expensive. No frayed edges, no browning petals, just like her life had become in the final years. Curated, controlled, immaculate. I knew maybe 3 faces in the room. The rest were strangers, people who had joined Elaine's orbit long after I'd been ejected from it. Executives, consultants, lawyers, investors. The kind of people who spoke in acronyms and thought retirement was a failure of imagination. I recognized a few from the dinner parties she used to host in the early days of her success, when I still tried to fit in, still wore a forced smile while listening to them debate stock options and global market forecasts. David works at the plant, Elaine would explain, her voice always just a touch too apologetic. He's not really in finance. Like being stable, present, and practical was something to whisper away like an old stain. Tyler had loved those parties. Even as a kid, he was comfortable in a blazer, sipping sparkling cider from crystal flutes, listening with wide eyes to men who talked about mergers and leveraged buyouts. By the time he was 12, he could hold his own in a conversation about corporate tax codes. He was smart, no doubt about that. But even smart kids need time to be kids. I tried to offer it camping trips, backyard football, late-night movies, but somewhere around 13, he started rolling his eyes when I spoke. "Dad doesn't get it," he'd say to Elaine with an exasperated shrug. "He thinks life is about fishing and fairy tales." He wasn't entirely wrong. I wanted him to know how to change a tire, how to cook scrambled eggs without burning them, how to talk to people without turning every conversation into a negotiation. But Elaine had other ideas. She believed the world was a war, and if you weren't building armor, you were preparing to lose. "Being a child is a luxury," she once told me, straight-faced as we stood in the kitchen watching Tyler unwrap a new laptop, his 3rd that year. "And we can't afford it." That conversation stayed with me for years. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it revealed something I hadn't fully understood until then. Elaine wasn't just building a company. She was building a legacy. And in that blueprint, I had no place. Not really. I was the man who held the flashlight while she rewired the house. Useful, perhaps, but replaceable. Our arguments grew colder, more precise. Not yelling, not door slams. Just silence stretched across long evenings and forced smiles at public functions. I still remember the night Tyler turned 15. Elaine had thrown him a party that looked more like a networking gala than a birthday. Caterers in black uniforms, a string quartet, name tags at the door. I stood in the corner near the buffet, watching our son shake hands like a politician, laughing a little too loud, holding court with people twice his age. When I suggested we do something simpler next year, just family, maybe a barbecue, Elaine looked at me like I'd asked if we could trade the chandelier for a ceiling fan. "This is the world he belongs to now, David," she said. "You want him to grow up soft, unprepared?" "No," I replied. "I want him to grow up human." Oh, that was the last real fight. After that, we both retreated, Elaine into her spreadsheets and meetings, me into the quiet corners of our too-big house. I cooked dinner most nights. Ate alone most nights, too. I attended every one of Tyler's school events, even when Elaine didn't. I clapped for his debate trophies, cheered at his award ceremonies, tried to talk afterward. But each year, it felt like I was speaking through thicker glass. By the time he graduated high school, Tyler barely said goodbye. He left for college with a crisp handshake and a muttered, "Thanks for everything." I stood at the curb waving to the back of a rental car that never looked back. And when Elaine missed his college graduation entirely, something about a last-minute negotiation in Seattle, I finally said what I should have said years before. "This isn't a marriage anymore," I told her that night. "It's a merger without a purpose." She didn't cry. Elaine never cried. She just nodded and went back to typing. We signed the divorce papers 6 months later. She got the company, the house, the car, the friends. I got a modest settlement and the key to the small, silent apartment I'd been living in ever since. Tyler cut ties not long after, claimed I was holding him back, that my values were limiting, that he couldn't be around, that kind of thinking. I didn't argue. I just watched him walk away, a leather briefcase in one hand and my heart in the other. And now, 17 years later, here we were sharing oxygen in the same room for the first time in over a decade. Elaine was gone, and Tyler looked like a polished statue sculpted in her image. The hair, the posture, the sharp angles of his jaw. But as he turned to face me fully, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe. Or fear, because for the first time he didn't know what I was doing there. And he hated not knowing. The service hadn't even started, but the air was already thick with judgment. It hung in the space between pews and clung to the backs of necks like static. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, not just from the strangers who'd only known Elaine in tailored suits and boardroom victories, but from people who once called themselves friends, neighbors, even family. People who, over the years, had quietly absorbed the rewritten narrative. That I was the anchor that nearly sank her rise. The man who couldn't keep up. The husband who couldn't evolve. No one ever asked for the full story. It was easier to believe the clean version. The one where she shed me like old skin on her way to becoming a legend. Then Tyler stood. He was near the front of the chapel, beside the urn that held what remained of the woman we had both loved. And when his voice rang out, it was sharp enough to slice through the soft organ music that had begun playing. "What are you doing here?" he said, his voice cool but loud enough for the entire room to hear. Conversations froze mid-whisper. A woman dropped a tissue. Someone shifted uncomfortably in the pew behind me. I stood slowly, meeting his eyes across the ocean of disapproval between us. "I came to pay my respects," I said evenly. "You lost the right to do that a long time ago," Tyler replied, already stepping into the aisle like a man preparing for trial. "She wouldn't have wanted you here." He walked toward me, each footfall measured, his voice rising just enough to invite an audience. "She spent the last 17 years building something incredible, and you, what did you do? Hide? Wallow? Live in that sad little apartment pretending you were the one who got left behind?" My mouth was dry, but I refused to look away. Around us, the chapel had gone still. No one coughed, no one stirred. Even the air seemed to hesitate. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here because once your mother and I promised each other forever. And even when forever doesn't last, promises matter." Tyler scoffed, loud and theatrical. "You embarrassed her. You dragged her down. You wanted her to settle for you, for your life, for your tiny little version of the world. And now what? You show up hoping for closure? Or sympathy? Because I promise you, Dad, you're not getting either." He turned to the crowd, gesturing at me with open disdain. "This is David Martin," he announced, like a courtroom prosecutor revealing the suspect. He spent 22 years reminding my mother that she was dreaming too big, that she should be grateful for less. That success made her cold. That ambition made her wrong. People nodded. A few murmured. One man, someone from the board, I think actually clapped, once, before thinking better of it. "You think you're entitled to mourn her?" Tyler said, eyes burning. "You weren't there. Not when she built the company from nothing. Not when she made it through the economic crash. Not when she fought to make this town respect her. You weren't part of that journey. You were baggage. It should have broken me. Once it might have. But as I stood there, the judgment heavy in the air, something inside me held firm. Not pride, not anger, Just something simple and unshakable. Memory. I was there, I said quietly. When she had her first idea scribbled on a napkin, when she doubted herself and needed someone to remind her that she could do anything. I was there before the contracts, before the clients, before the awards. And I stayed for years after it stopped being easy. So no, Tyler, I don't expect sympathy. But I earned the right to say goodbye. He didn't respond, just stared at me like I'd spoken in a language he hadn't heard in years. The organ began again, a gentle cue from the funeral director to take our seats. Tyler finally turned away, walking back to the front pew with the same rigidity he'd inherited from his mother. The rest of the chapel turned with him, but I remained standing for a moment longer, my hands at my sides, my chest steady. I had loved Elaine Wen, and that meant something. Even now, especially now, when the service ended, I stayed seated as the chapel slowly emptied. People filtered past me like I was part of the furniture, eyes fixed forward, lips pressed thin, some whispering condolences to Tyler, while others offered nothing at all, not a single glance in my direction. It didn't surprise me. I wasn't part of her final act, at least not in their version of the story. I was a footnote, a ghost in the margins. I watched Tyler shake hands near the altar, all poise and polish, accepting sympathy like a CEO delivering a quarterly report. Grief, to him, was performance, controlled, branded. Even his mourning was strategic. I reached for my coat, ready to slip out quietly the way I'd come in, when a voice stopped me. "Mr. Martin?" A man in a dark, tailored suit stepped forward, leather briefcase in hand. "I'm Richard Hale. We spoke briefly by phone. I'm the executor of Miss Wynn's estate." He extended his hand, firm and respectful. I stood and shook it, unsure of what came next. "Elaine requested that you and Tyler both attend the reading of her will," he said. "It's scheduled in an hour, at my office. She was specific about your presence." I hesitated. I wasn't expecting... "She was," Richard interrupted gently. "And legally, I can't proceed without you." Across the room, Tyler noticed us speaking. His jaw tightened, and he moved toward us like a storm gathering speed. "What is he doing here?" he snapped. "This doesn't concern him." Richard remained calm. "Your mother's will names Mr. Martin explicitly. His presence is required." Tyler looked between us, nostrils flared, fists clenched. But he didn't argue. Not really. Not yet. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's get this over with." "How?" And just like that, we walked into the next chapter together, but not united, two men tethered by grief, legacy, and a woman neither of us had ever truly stopped loving. Richard Hale's office sat 3 blocks from the chapel, nestled inside a converted Victorian house with bay windows, dark wood trim, and the kind of tasteful landscaping that whispered generational wealth. We walked there in silence, the 3 of us, me in my outdated coat and scuffed shoes, Tyler in a suit that probably cost more than my car, and Richard in quiet professionalism, the perfect buffer between tension and civility. The streets were quiet. Casper was always quiet this time of day, with the afternoon sun cutting low across old brick buildings and the wind stirring fallen blossoms from the funeral's floral arrangements, still clinging to the soles of our shoes. Tyler walked half a step ahead of me, never looking back. If he noticed the uneven rhythm of my steps, or the slight limp in my right leg, a souvenir from the plant accident years ago, he said nothing. He was focused, controlled, rehearsing perhaps, imagining himself at the head of the boardroom table, ready to inherit the empire he believed was already his. Richard held the door open and guided us through a paneled hallway into a room that felt more like a study than a law office. Deep green walls, a fireplace with a marble mantel, leather chairs that creaked with age and authority, bookcases lined with titles I suspected were more decorative than functional. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and old money. "Please," Richard said, gesturing toward the 2 chairs opposite his desk. Tyler immediately took the one closest to the window, angling himself to face Richard directly. I took the other, slightly off to the side, a position I was used to. It felt appropriate. Richard settled behind the desk and opened a thick manila folder, carefully sliding out a stack of bound documents. His demeanor shifted from cordial to formal, the air in the room thickening with every click of the paper clips and shuffle of pages. This is the last will and testament of Elaine Thunewen, executed the 3rd of April, 2025, he began, his voice precise and calm. It supersedes all previous wills and was signed in accordance with Wyoming law, witnessed and notarized, and confirmed by independent medical and psychological evaluations to affirm soundness of mind. Tyler nodded along impatiently, already expecting what he would hear. His foot tapped quietly beneath the desk. I sat still, hands clasped in my lap, not expecting anything except maybe a line in the margins. A forgiveness, a trinket, a quiet acknowledgement that once for a long time we had mattered. Richard continued, "To my son, Tyler James Martin, I leave the residence located at 2240 Laurel Ridge Drive, including all furnishings, artwork, and personal property therein. I also bequeath the sum of $750,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate." Tyler's expression didn't change much, but I saw the twitch of satisfaction in his jaw, the small upward curl at the corners of his mouth. He nodded as if this was only natural, and perhaps to him it was. The house alone was worth over $1 million. Combined with the cash, a generous gift by any standard. But Richard wasn't finished. "These assets," he continued, "are contingent upon Mr. Martin's continued employment with Nguyen Strategic Ventures for a minimum of 2 years following the execution of this will, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved." Tyler blinked, the flicker of uncertainty breaking through his polished exterior. "Wait," he said, voice tight. "What do you mean until the company is sold? Who would be selling it?" Richard paused only briefly, a trained pause, then lifted another page. "I will now read the following clause regarding the remaining assets of the estate." Tyler sat forward, but I suddenly felt myself drawing back, like my chair had shifted an inch without warning. Something in Richard's tone had changed so subtle, most would miss it. But not me. I'd spent decades reading tension in silences. "To my former husband, David Elias Martin," Richard said, "I bequeath the remaining holdings of my estate, including but not limited to $44, $5 million held in diversified investment portfolios and financial accounts, as well as 70% controlling interest in Wynn Strategic Ventures and all its affiliated subsidiaries and assets. Mr. Meister Martin is hereby appointed chairman of the board." The room fell silent. It wasn't the comfortable silence of agreement, or the reverent hush of reflection. No, this was the silence that comes after a bomb has dropped, when your ears are ringing and all you can do is blink and try to understand what just happened. I think I forgot how to breathe. Tyler, however, found his voice quickly. "What the hell did you just say?" he barked, standing so fast that his chair shot backward and slammed into the bookshelf. Richard remained calm, his eyes meeting Tyler's. "The instructions are clear. Your mother left the majority of her estate, financial, corporate, and operational, in Mr. Martin's hands." "You expect me to believe this?" Tyler spat, pointing at me like I was something scraped from the bottom of his shoe. "He hasn't spoken to her in nearly 2 decades. He abandoned us. He has no business running a lemonade stand, let alone her company." Richard adjusted his glasses. "Your mother updated her will 14 months ago. She was of sound mind and took every legal precaution to ensure its validity. This was her decision." Tyler turned on me, his face twisted with fury and disbelief. "What did you do to her?" he hissed. "You visit her behind my back? Manipulate her? Feed her lies when she was sick and alone?" "I didn't even know she was dying," I said softly, truthfully. "She wasn't," Richard interjected firmly. "Elaine was not terminally ill. She passed unexpectedly. But at the time this document was executed, she was in excellent health physically and mentally." Tyler's hands balled into fists. No, this isn't right. This can't be right. She wouldn't do this to me." Richard met his gaze with quiet authority. "She didn't do it to you, Mr. Martin. She did it for him." Tyler's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment he looked 10 years old again, lost, unsure, desperate to believe the world was still under his control. But when he looked back at me, all he saw was the man he'd spent years blaming for everything he didn't want to understand. "You manipulated her," he muttered, trembling now. "You fed her some guilt-ridden story, and she fell for it. She left me crumbs and gave you the throne. You, the man who gave up on her the moment life got complicated." I shook my head, slowly. I never gave up on her, Tyler. She just stopped needing me. Richard cleared his throat and reached for another envelope, sealed in cream paper with personal message written across the front in Elaine's familiar cursive. She anticipated your reactions, he said. She wrote something intended for both of you to be read after this portion of the will. Tyler stepped back, breathing hard, his eyes red. He didn't speak. Not this time, and I, still rooted in disbelief, leaned forward just enough to say, "Then maybe it's time we heard what she had to say." Richard nodded, broke the seal, and began to read. And in that room filled with silence and unfinished grief, the voice of the woman we had both loved began to speak again. "My dearest David," Richard began, his voice softening as he unfolded the letter. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in that old green chair at Richard's office, wondering what the hell I was thinking. I can picture your face right now, that expression you used to get whenever I reorganized the kitchen cabinets without telling you confused, polite, just a little exasperated." A low breath escaped my chest, half a laugh, half something else. She wasn't wrong. Even from the grave, Elaine knew how to disarm me in one sentence. "I know this inheritance must feel like a mistake," Richard continued, still reading in her voice. "Like some clerical error or a ghost of guilt come back to haunt you. But it isn't. It's deliberate and long overdue. David, you deserve every bit of it. Not because you were perfect, but because you were good. Because you loved me when I was still learning how to love myself. Because you never once asked me to be smaller." The room was still. Even Tyler, now seated again, leaned slightly forward, his arms crossed tight across his chest, trying to armor himself against her words. "I spent years angry with you," the letter said. "Angry that you couldn't understand what I was chasing. But what I didn't say, what I never had the courage to admit, was that I was even angrier at myself for choosing the chase over you, over us. I thought success would quiet the doubts, would finally make me feel like I was enough. But it never did. Not really. And in the quiet moments, between meetings, between flights, between wins, I would remember you, your steadiness, your decency, the way you looked at me like I was more than the sum of my ambition." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. I didn't wipe them away. Let them fall. Let them cleanse. "Tyler," Richard continued, voice growing slightly more measured, "my beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're angry, maybe even devastated. You've lived your life under the weight of my expectations, thinking that being my legacy meant inheriting everything I built. But legacies are more than assets. They are choices. They are character. They are what we leave behind in the hearts of the people we love." I glanced at my son. His jaw was locked, but his eyes flickered something wounded and raw just beneath the surface. "You've never failed me, Tyler," the letter said, "but you've also never really been tested. You were raised in comfort, in polish, in perfection. You've succeeded, yes, but always within the framework I designed. I'm giving you freedom now, not punishment. You have a home. You have a fortune many would envy. But more importantly, you have the chance to build something that's yours, not mine. To lead in your own way, without my shadow guiding your every move." Tyler exhaled sharply through his nose. Still rigid, still seething, but quieter. "David," the letter turned back to me, "I'm giving you the company not as a reward but as a trust. Because you, more than anyone, will treat it not as a monument to my success, but as a responsibility to the people it supports. I know you don't think you're ready, but I do, because you've lived a life of service. You've understood what it means to carry burdens without applause, and I believe truly that you will turn this business into something more human than I ever could." The room felt warmer now, the sunlight filtering through Richard's windows, falling across the papers like a benediction. "Use the wealth to lift others. Use the company to do good. And most of all, use this gift to forgive yourself for the marriage that broke, for the silence that followed, for the years we wasted being too proud to speak." I pressed a hand to my chest. The ache there wasn't pain, it was recognition. "I loved you, David," the letter ended, "in all the ways I knew how, even when I couldn't say it, even when I was too stubborn to show it. And Tyler, I loved you fiercely, but love isn't measured by control or inheritance. It's measured by what we leave behind when we stop trying to be more and start trying to be whole. Please be whole. Richard lowered the letter and folded it carefully back into its envelope. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, without a word, Tyler stood. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Richard. He simply turned, walked to the window, and stared out over the town his mother had once ruled and had now, somehow, left in the hands of the man he had spent most of his life despising. And I just sat there, with her words echoing in my ribs, like the soft ringing of a bell finally struck after 17 years of silence. Tyler stayed at that window for what felt like a lifetime, the light casting long shadows across his back, his shoulders hunched in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, standing outside my apartment the night he told me he couldn't be around me anymore. But this was different. Back then, he'd carried the confidence of a boy who believed every door in the world would open if he pushed hard enough. Now, he looked like a man who just realized some doors were never his to begin with. I remained in my chair, the envelope still warm in my hand, fingers curled around the edges of her letter like it might disappear if I let go. I didn't know what to say. Every instinct told me to stand, to go to him, to offer something, an apology, a bridge, a truth, but I stayed still, not out of pride, but caution, because we were both standing on the edge of something that could collapse with a single wrong word. Richard, ever the professional, began gathering the paperwork with a quiet efficiency, breaking the silence with the soft shuffle of legal pages and the creak of leather bindings. "There will be documents to sign," he said gently, "and transitions to oversee. I'll have my team prepare a timeline for asset transfers and board announcements. Mr. Martin David, you'll have full access to company records by next week." I nodded absently, still watching Tyler, whose breath fogged the glass ever so slightly. He was unraveling. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I could feel the tension radiating off him, the invisible cords of expectation snapping one by one. Then, without turning around, he spoke. "This isn't over." His voice was low, almost hoarse. "I can contest this. You know that, right? Undue influence, lack of capacity, fraud. I can pull every thread until it unravels." Richard didn't flinch. "You're welcome to pursue any legal avenue, Tyler. But I can assure you, your mother took extraordinary care to ensure this will could not be challenged. Psychological evaluations, recorded testimony, witnesses. She knew what she was doing." Tyler turned then, finally facing me, and I saw in his eyes not just fury but pain. Deep, bruising pain. "She chose you," he said, each word bitten off like it hurt to say them. "She gave you everything I worked for, everything I sacrificed for. She handed it to you like a consolation prize for staying mediocre." I shook my head slowly, not in denial, but in mourning. "I didn't ask for any of this, Tyler. I didn't expect it. I came to the funeral to say goodbye, not to inherit an empire." He stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You expect me to believe that? After all these years? After vanishing from our lives? After letting her carry the weight alone? You just magically show up and walk away with everything?" His voice cracked on the last word, and for a second the room blurred around the edges, not from heat or light, but from memory. The years I'd spent trying to reach him through birthday cards he never answered, through phone calls that went to voicemail, through long, aching silences filled only with the sound of a dial tone. "She didn't do this to you, Tyler," I said quietly. "She did it for you, to give you a chance to step out from under her shadow and build something of your own." His laugh was sharp and humorless. "Don't feed me that sanctimonious garbage. You think I want your wisdom now? You think I need a redemption arc so you can feel like a hero in your twilight years?" He stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward me. "You're nothing but a tired old man with a lucky break. And this?" He gestured at the letter, the folder, the entire room. "This doesn't make you worthy. It just makes you in the way." I felt something inside me flicker, something that had long since dulled after years of being the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one who walked away instead of escalating. But not this time. "Maybe I am in the way," I said, standing slowly, my knees stiff from sitting too long. "But your mother thought I was worth trusting, not because I was brilliant or ruthless or charming, but because I showed up when it mattered. Because I didn't treat people like chess pieces. Because I knew when to stop taking and start serving. Tyler's face twisted with rage. "You think she loved you more?" he shouted. "You think that's what this means?" "I think," I said, voice steady now, "that she remembered who I was before the noise, before the ambition, before the silence. And she saw that maybe, just maybe, some part of that man was still worth something." Richard stepped in then, a necessary interruption before the room ignited. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "this is not the time nor the place. You both have things to process. But I would advise we keep this civil." Tyler looked at him, then back at me, and for a moment I thought he might lunge, might do something reckless, just to make the pain external. But instead, he turned and grabbed his coat, fists clenched tight. "You've won," he said bitterly. "Enjoy your kingdom." He paused at the door, his voice dropping lower. "But don't think for a second this is over." He left then, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than any slam. Silence returned, but this one felt heavier, more final. Richard let out a slow breath and began arranging the papers on his desk again. "We'll be in touch," he said. I nodded, unable to speak just yet. I stood there a long moment, listening to the ticking of the antique clock behind him, the creak of the building as it settled into its own kind of mourning. Eventually, I stepped out into the hallway, the scent of old wood and furniture polish following me. Outside, the sky was the color of ash, the wind pulling at the edges of my coat. I walked the 3 blocks back to my car in silence, keys cold in my hand, her letter pressed like scripture against my chest. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel rich. I just felt responsible. She had given me everything not as a reward, but as a charge, a challenge, a second chance to be something I hadn't been in years, not just a man, but a steward of something larger than myself. And somewhere, as the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall on the windshield of my old Toyota, I felt her presence again, not in grandeur or sentiment, but in the quiet insistence of her final choice. A woman who'd built an empire and handed it not to the most ambitious man in the room, but to the one who'd once held her hand when she didn't know what came next. I turned the key in the ignition and watched the town blur through the wipers, knowing that tomorrow everything would be different. But for the first time in a long, long while, I was ready. The next morning I woke before the sun, as if my body understood something my mind hadn't yet processed. The world had shifted, and I couldn't sleep through it anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed in the quiet gloom of my apartment, staring down at the floor where yesterday's dress shoes still sat, faintly scuffed and too tight at the toes. The letter from Elaine rested on the nightstand, neatly folded, exactly where I'd placed it the night before, after rereading it under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. I hadn't cried again, but I hadn't stopped feeling either. Her words had lingered in me all night, woven into my thoughts, my breathing, the slow beat of my heart, as it tried to accept that what she'd given me wasn't just money or power, but something far harder to earn. Belief. I dressed slowly, pulling on the only sport coat I owned and the same dark slacks I'd worn to the funeral. I had no wardrobe for this kind of life, no drawer full of silk ties or cufflinks with family crests. I was still the same man who took his trash out every Wednesday at 7 and bought his coffee from the gas station on Birch. But today, I was also the majority owner of a corporation with offices in 4 states and an annual revenue that made my stomach turn when Richard's assistant emailed me the spreadsheets. Today, I was the chairman of the board. It sounded like a joke, like a headline from a satirical news site. Retired power plant worker inherits multi-million-dollar empire from ex-wife. But it wasn't a joke. It was the legal, notarized, airtight truth. And whatever I thought of myself, whatever doubts I still carried about my worthiness, Elaine had left no room for escape. Her instructions had been clear. Take it, carry it, protect it, grow it, or step aside and let someone else dismantle everything she'd built. So I drove across town past the same coffee shop, where Elaine and I used to get croissants on Sunday mornings. Past the old movie theater we took Tyler to when he was little and afraid of the dark and parked in front of Wynn Strategic Ventures. The building stood 6 stories tall, sleek and modern, with reflective glass and chrome signage. It looked like it had landed in Wyoming by mistake, like it belonged somewhere in San Francisco or Chicago. But it was Elaine's mark on this town, her monument to what was possible when you refused to shrink. I stepped through the front doors and into the lobby, greeted by polished floors, abstract artwork, and a receptionist whose smile faltered for just a second when she saw me. "Mr. Martin?" she asked, uncertain. "You have an appointment?" I nodded. "I believe I do. First day on the job." She blinked, trying to mask her surprise, then gestured toward the elevators. "Of course." The executive floor. "Mr. Hale said you'd be arriving." The ride-up was silent but tense. The kind of silence that isn't really empty, it just holds too many unspoken things. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a space that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and expensive paper. A woman with short gray hair and a sharp blazer met me at the reception desk. "David Martin?" "Yes. I'm Julia, executive assistant to the board. I worked with Elaine for nearly 12 years. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and her expression was measured, curious, but not unkind. "Mr. Hale mentioned you might want a briefing. I've prepared a transition packet for your review, along with access credentials and contact logs." "Thank you," I said. "This is a bit overwhelming." Her face softened slightly. "You're not the first to feel that way, but you'll find most of us are used to adapting quickly. That's how she built this place." "Oh." I followed Julia into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view that stretched past the edge of town to the snowy caps in the distance. Elaine's office. Her chair was still there, angled just slightly away from the desk like she'd only stepped out to take a call. The air smelled faintly of her perfume, something citrusy and sharp. I stood there a moment, looking around at the space she'd shaped with such precision. The books on the shelves weren't decorative. They were dog-eared, bookmarked, annotated. Titles on management theory, behavioral economics, psychology. Beside the computer monitor was a photograph of Tyler, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on her lap in the middle of a messy desk, both of them laughing. "She never took that photo down," Julia said from behind me, voice softer now, "even when things changed." I nodded, throat tight. She was a force. "She was," Julia agreed. "But she was also human. Most people didn't get to see that side." I turned to face her. "I think maybe I saw it too late." "She chose you, Mr. Martin," Julia said simply. "Whatever doubts you have, she didn't. That counts for something." I spent the next 2 hours in meetings Richard joined for part of it, walking me through the financials and legal structure. I met the heads of departments, who looked at me like they were trying to fit a square peg into the memory of a round hole. But they were polite, professional, even welcoming, in their cautious way. No one said what they were thinking, but I could see the questions flickering behind their smiles. Why him? Why now? What does this mean for us? I didn't have all the answers yet. I didn't pretend to, but I asked questions. I listened. I took notes. And when I finally sat in Elaine's chair, after everyone else had left and the office had gone quiet, I placed her letter on the desk and read it one more time, not because I needed the instructions, but because I needed to feel her nearby. The afternoon sun poured through the glass, casting a golden glow over everything, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this wasn't a fluke, or a burden, or a punishment in disguise. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was love in its final, most courageous form, a gift not of wealth or legacy, but of trust. She believed I could do this. She saw something in me I'd stopped seeing in myself. And if she could believe again, then so could I. 2 weeks passed before I heard from Tyler again. I wasn't surprised by the silence. If anything, I welcomed it. It gave me time to breathe, to think, to understand what I had inherited, not just in legal terms, but in emotional ones. I spent those days at Wynn Strategic Ventures, arriving early and staying late, sitting in on meetings I didn't fully understand, reading through binders of annual reports and department updates, learning names, listening more than I spoke. The management team was cautious at first, but gradually something shifted. Maybe it was the way I admitted what I didn't know without shame. Maybe it was the way I showed up every day, without arrogance or bluster, asking the kinds of questions no one had asked in years, not about profit margins or market share, but about people, morale, retention, burnout. The things Elaine had once cared about deeply, before ambition turned everything into a calculation. I found her fingerprints everywhere in the way the marketing department still quoted her favorite branding principles, in the human resources policies she'd designed to prioritize talent development over short-term output, in the hand-signed birthday cards she'd sent to every employee for years until her calendar could no longer keep up. And in those details, I felt her again, not the CEO people whispered about in awe, but the woman I had met in a diner 37 years ago. The woman who'd fought for dignity in the workplace before anyone handed her a corner office. I tried to carry that version of her with me into every decision I made. I didn't make sweeping changes. I didn't walk in with a sledgehammer. I asked the board for time, and I used it to listen. And somewhere in that process, I began to feel not like an imposter, but like a steward. One afternoon, just as the office was quieting for the evening, my assistant Julia knocked on the glass wall of my office and entered without waiting. "You have a visitor," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Your son." I stood before I could think better of it. "He's here?" She nodded once. "He's in conference room, B. Said he didn't want to disturb your workflow." I tried not to read too much into that. I walked down the corridor, my palms sweating slightly, my pulse steady but low. The door was ajar. I pushed it open to find Tyler standing at the head of the table, arms crossed, suit immaculate, eyes guarded. "Thanks for seeing me," he said, without looking up. I closed the door behind me and took a seat at the far end of the table, leaving the space between us open. "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted. He didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. "I wanted to say a few things, then I'll go." I nodded. He took a breath, bracing himself. "I've spoken with 3 different lawyers. They all told me the same thing. Contesting the will would be a long, expensive process with little chance of success." I waited. "I considered it anyway," he continued. "For a few days I thought about fighting, making it messy, trying to prove something." "And?" I asked. He met my eyes finally, and I saw a flicker of exhaustion beneath the hard lines of his expression. And then I realized I didn't even know what I was trying to prove. That she owed me more? That you didn't deserve it? That I was entitled to a life I didn't build? He exhaled slowly and looked away. She was right, about everything. I spent so long trying to be perfect, her perfect son, her perfect successor, that I never stopped to think about what I actually wanted. I was so wrapped up in becoming her legacy that I never created anything of my own. There was silence then, a deep one, the kind you don't rush. I let it settle before I responded. "That's a hard truth to come to," I said. "I know, I've had to learn a few myself lately." He looked at me again, softer this time. "I hated you," he said. "I know," I replied. "I blamed you for everything that didn't make sense, for the coldness, for the pressure, for the way she always seemed more focused on winning than living. But you weren't the problem. Not really. She made her choices, and so did I." He paused. "But I think maybe I'm ready to start making different ones." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. "I'm not asking for a position here," he added quickly. "I need space, distance. I need to figure out what a life without all this looks like." He gestured to the glass walls, the conference table, the name etched on the door. "I'm not ready to carry it. Not yet." I leaned forward slightly. "Then take the time. Build something. Make your own legacy." "Maybe," he said. Then, after a beat, "But I wanted you to know I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to contest anything. I don't agree with how it all went down, but I understand it now. Or at least I'm trying to." I nodded slowly, feeling a weight shift, not disappear, but ease, like a belt loosened after a long day. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." He turned toward the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "You're not who I thought you were." "Neither are you," I replied. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he left, and for the first time in years, the silence he left behind didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something else. Something true. I didn't go back to my office right away. After Tyler left, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the conference room, staring through the glass walls at the reflection of a man I barely recognized. Not because he looked different, though, maybe he did, but because of the way he stood. Straighter, steadier, as if something deep inside had finally begun to settle after years of quiet upheaval. I placed a hand briefly on the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips, and then I walked. Not toward the elevator, not toward my desk. I took the stairs one flight up to the rooftop garden Elaine had insisted on installing when she'd renovated the building 7 years ago. If people have to work in boxes, she'd once told a journalist, the least we can do is give them a place to breathe. I remembered reading that quote back then and rolling my eyes. It had sounded so rehearsed, so perfectly crafted. But now, as I stepped out onto the rooftop, into a space of wind and quiet green, I realized she hadn't been posturing. She'd meant it. It was beautiful up there, planters full of native flowers, benches worn smooth by seasons of use, wind chimes softly singing from the pergola. A space carved out not for power lunches or networking events, but for solitude, for reflection. I sat on the far bench, under the shadow of a maple tree, just beginning to blush with the earliest hints of autumn, and let myself feel the weight of everything. The grief, the gratitude, the impossible grace of being forgiven by someone who was no longer here. Elaine was gone. And yet somehow, in the decisions she had made in those final months, in the precise language of her will, in the aching honesty of her letter, she had reached back across time and pulled me forward into something new. Not a replacement for what we'd lost, but a chance to carry it differently, with purpose, with care. I thought about Tyler, his anger, his confusion, his reluctant truthfulness, and I felt something strange and unexpected bloom in my chest. Pride. Not in his pain, but in his willingness to look it in the eye. He wasn't there yet. Maybe he wouldn't be for a while. But he was no longer running from the hard parts, and that was more than I could have asked for. When I returned to the office that afternoon, I found a small envelope on my desk. No name, just my initials in black ink. Inside was a card from Julia, my assistant. "You're doing better than you think. Keep going." I smiled and slipped it into my wallet. That evening, I stayed late, working through documents until the building was quiet and the sky outside turned purple. Before I left, I turned off the desk lamp, looked once more at the picture of Elaine and Tyler from years ago, and whispered a quiet thank you for the company, for the belief, for the redemption. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Mornings began with coffee and a walk through each department, an idea borrowed from my time at the power plant, where the best way to solve a problem was to see it with your own eyes. I spoke with junior staffers and executives alike, asked them what they needed, what they feared, what they hoped for. I didn't always know what to do with the answers, but I listened, and they noticed. Within a month, things began to shift. Not dramatically, there were no press releases or sweeping reorganizations, but subtly, like a ship adjusting course. People started showing up earlier. Meetings ended with laughter. I heard someone refer to the boardroom as David's Corner, and it didn't sound sarcastic. And slowly, I began to understand what Elaine had seen. Not just in me, but in the company itself. She had built something durable not because she'd chased profit, but because she had created a structure that could adapt, that could evolve. And maybe, in her final decision, she had made the company evolve one last time, by handing it to someone who didn't speak the language of ambition, but the language of responsibility. 6 weeks after the will reading, I received a letter from Tyler. It wasn't long. He'd moved to Oregon, was looking at grad programs, thinking about starting something small, a consulting service that worked with nonprofits and education centers. "I want to help people who are building things that matter," he wrote. Not just things that grow. There was no apology in the letter, but there didn't need to be. Growth, I realized, doesn't always begin with the word sorry. Sometimes it begins with a decision to turn in a new direction. That weekend I visited Elaine's grave for the first time since the funeral. I brought flowers, wild ones, like the bouquet she'd carried at our wedding all those years ago. I sat by the headstone for over an hour, speaking aloud like she might answer, but knowing she wouldn't. I told her about the company, about Tyler, about the way the light fell through the office windows each morning, just the way she liked it. I told her I missed her, that I always had. And then, just before I left, I placed a folded note beneath the vase of flowers. It read, "You gave me back my life. I promise to make it count. As I walked back to my car, I didn't feel the weight I'd carried into that chapel weeks ago. I didn't feel like an intruder in someone else's story. I felt like a man who had finally been given the chance to write his own ending. And maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We bring you powerful, human-centered stories like this every week. Stories about love, loss, redemption, and the quiet moments that change everything. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that matters, not just noise, but narratives that reflect real emotions and lasting truths. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and join a growing community of listeners who believe in the power of storytelling. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this story spoke to you the most. Was it the final act of forgiveness? The twist in the will? The quiet healing between father and son? Your perspective matters here. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone navigating grief, family conflict, or the long road back to self-worth, go ahead and share this video with them. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the best chapters come after the hardest pages.